Some men come back out of the deep woods and never quite stop being quiet afterward. You've met one, maybe, or you will. The kind who goes still when a branch taps the glass at night. The kind who counts without knowing he's counting. The seconds between a sound and the place it should have come from. The man in tonight's story was like that for the rest of his life. And he had his reasons. And by the end of this, you may understand them better than his own wife ever did. So before we step in under those trees together, let me ask you something, the way I always do. Where are you listening from tonight? What's on the other side of your own window right now, while my voice is in your ears? A city that never goes fully dark, a field, a road with no lights on it for a long, long way. Tell me in the comments. I like knowing how far this voice has to travel before it finds you, because the man in this story learned that distance is a strange thing in the woods, and that a voice can carry farther than it has any right to. A small thing before we begin. If what you're about to hear is the kind of story you'd want more of, I've gathered 10 of them into an audiobook called The Hollow Files. 5 hours, 10 counties. The same voice you're listening to right now, telling the ones I couldn't fit into a single night. You'll find the link down in the description and pinned right at the top of the comments. Go look when this is done. For now, let me tell you about Garrick Voss and the autumn he went up to Cold Mount to measure a stand of timber, and what an old man told him in the dark, and why he never raised his voice again for the rest of his days. It was the autumn of 1911, and the man's name was Garrick Voss. He was 33 years old, a land surveyor by trade, sent up from the valley offices on a paper contract to walk and chain, and mark a tract of high timber that a lumber concern wanted to know the true size of before they paid for it. He was a tall man, narrow through the shoulders with the kind of long, careful stride that surveyors get from packing distances all their lives. And his hands were not soft, but not a laborer's either. Ink at the knuckles and a callus on the right middle finger from 40 years of pressing a pencil down hard. Forgive me, from his own years of it. He had a brown mustache he kept trimmed close, a habit of folding his maps the same way every time so the creases never wore through, and a quiet that people sometimes took for coldness until they worked with him a few days and understood it was only carefulness. He had lost his older brother to the river 2 springs before, a thing he did not talk about, and he carried that the way a man carries a stone in his boot on a long walk, aware of it with every step but unwilling to stop and shake it out. That stone matters later. Hold on to it. The depot town was called Cold Mount, and it was the last place on the line where the train stopped before the rails ran out and the country went up into timber so thick and so old that the loggers had not yet reached it. Cold Mount was a general store, a Methodist church with a bell that had cracked and never been recast, a livery, a row of houses gone gray as driftwood, and not much else but the wind. Garrick stepped down off the train with his transit and his chains and his rucksack of provisions. And the storekeeper, a broad, slow man named Whiston Crail, who wore his spectacles pushed up into his hair, looked at the surveyor's gear and then at the surveyor's face, and asked him where exactly the company meant for him to go. Garrick unfolded the map and put his finger on the gray blank above the last marked creek where someone in an office had written Timber Est. 4,000 acres in a clerk's tidy hand. Crail looked at that finger for a long moment. Then he took his spectacles down out of his hair, cleaned them on his apron, though they did not need cleaning, and put them back and said, "That's the hasher you're pointing at, mister." Garrick said he didn't know it had a name. Crail said it had a name the way a grave has a name. People give it one so they don't have to keep describing the thing. Now Garrick Voss was not a superstitious man. He had been to college a year, and he believed in chains and angles and the slow, honest arithmetic of the world. And he took the storekeeper's strangeness for the ordinary strangeness of back-country people who liked to spook the men from the valley. He bought what he needed: a sack of cornmeal and a side of bacon wrapped in cheesecloth, a tin of matches, a coil of light rope, a fresh box of cartridges for the lever rifle he carried more out of habit than fear. And as he was paying, Crail leaned on the counter and said it plain, the way you tell a man a bridge was out. "There's one fellow lives up in there," he said, "old Thresh, Obadiah Thresh, Been up in the hush longer than I've been alive, and I'm not young. You find his place, you mind him. Whatever he tells you, you do it, even if it makes no sense to a college man." "Especially then," Garrick asked, not unkindly. What an old man could tell him that a compass couldn't. And Crail said, "The compass will tell you where north is. Thresh will tell you when to stand still." And then he would say no more about it and rang up the sail and wished Garrick good light, which is a thing they say up there instead of good luck. And Garrick walked out into the cold, bright morning and went up the wagon road as far as a wagon could go. And then he went up the foot trail. And then there was no trail at all, only the trees. I want you to understand the kind of country it was, because the country is half the story. The trees were spruce and hemlock and old beech, and they grew so close and so high that even at noon the light came down green and thin like light through pond water, and the ground was deep with needles that took your footsteps and gave back no sound, so that a man walking made less noise than his own breathing. There were no birds. Garrick noticed that by the second hour and could not stop noticing it. He had hunted and surveyed in a dozen forests, and there had always been birds, jays scolding, the knock of a woodpecker, the small busy nothing sounds that tell you a place is alive. Here there was a silence that had weight to it, that pressed on the ears the way deep water presses on the ears of a man who dives too far down. And after a while Garrick found he was humming under his breath just to have something to push against. And then he found he had stopped humming without deciding to, because the humming sounded wrong and all that quiet, like singing in a church with no one in it. He worked through that first day the way he always worked, setting his transit, citing his lines, driving his little marked stakes, writing his figures in the leather book he kept buttoned in his breast pocket. He made good distance. He found a place by a black, slow creek to lay his bedroll, and he built a small fire, and the fire was a comfort. And he ate his bacon and his pan bread, and he told himself the storekeeper was a man who'd spent too many winters with too few people. And he slept. And in the night he woke, not to a sound, to the absence of one. The creek beside him had been talking all evening, that low, constant water talk you stop hearing because it never stops. And now it had stopped, and the stopping of it had reached down into his sleep and pulled him up out of it like a hand. He lay still in his bedroll and listened to the creek not running. There is no good reason for a creek to go quiet. Water does not hold its breath. And then, very far off, from up the slope where the timber went black, he heard something call. It was not a wolf, and it was not an owl. It was a long single note, almost like a word, almost like a name said slow by someone who had only heard the name once and was trying to remember it. And then the creek began to run again all at once, the way water does when you take your hand out of it. And Garrick lay awake until the green light came back. And in the morning he told himself it had been a dream. The way we all tell ourselves things in the morning. He worked a second day and the country got stranger, and I'll tell you how. Because it wasn't one big thing, it was 100 small ones. And that is how these places work on a man. His compass began to disagree with the sun. Not wildly, just enough. He'd sight a line by the needle and check it against where the light came through, and the two would be off by a few degrees, and a few degrees is nothing on a short line, but it is everything across 4,000 acres, and a surveyor lives and dies by his lines. He'd reset and start again, and the next sighting would be off the other way. He found one of his own marked stakes from the first day standing in a place his figures said he had never been. He stood looking at that stake for a long time. He knew his own hand. He knew the mark he cut. There it was. His mark in a stand of beech he was certain he was seeing for the first time. And the certainty and the stake could not both be true. And that is the exact feeling, that small, sick, swimming feeling of two true things that cannot both be true, that the hush feeds on. By the afternoon of the second day, Garrick Voss was a careful, college-educated, unsuspicious man who no longer knew with certainty which way the valley lay. And the light was beginning to slant. And he understood in a cold, clean way that had nothing to do with fear yet that he was lost. Now, you, listening to me right now, have you ever been turned around somewhere you knew? A building you'd been in 100 times, a road you'd driven your whole life, and for 10 seconds, 20, the world rotated under you, and up was a stranger. Tell me about it in the comments, because Garrick said later that the worst part was not the being lost. The worst part was the moment just before, when he still thought he knew where he was and was wrong, and could feel the wrongness coming up under his certainty like water under ice. Hold that feeling. He had it for 2 more hours, and then the fog came. It came up out of the ground, not down from the sky. Up the way breath comes up off a pond at dawn, except this was late afternoon, and there was no reason for it. And it came fast, faster than fog has any business moving, until Garrick could see his own outstretched hand in the gray and not much past it. And in the fog the silence got worse, if a thing can get worse than total, because now the fog ate even his footsteps and his breathing. And he had the sense, the absolutely certain and absolutely unprovable sense, that he was not alone in it, that something was keeping pace with him just past the edge of the gray, matching him, stopping when he stopped. He stopped, the thing that was not there stopped. He went on, it went on. And then, soft from no particular direction, the fog said his name, Garrick. Just that, in a voice he knew, in his brother's voice. His brother who had been 2 springs in the ground. He did not answer. I want you to know that, because it's the thing that saved him, though he didn't understand why yet. Some animal part of him, some part older than his college year and his transit and his arithmetic, clamped his teeth shut on the answer that was already rising in his throat. And he stood in the fog with his dead brother's voice saying his name a second time. Closer, gentler, the way you'd call to a man you didn't want to startle, and he did not answer. And he did not run, though every nerve in him was screaming, "Run, run now." And while he stood there shaking with the cold sweat running down inside his collar, a light bloomed in the gray off to his left. A small warm square of light, a window, a lamp in a window, and from beside that window, a real voice, an old man's voice, dry as a dead leaf, said low and steady, "Don't you move toward me sudden, son. Come slow. Come like you got all night, and keep your eyes on that light, and don't you look behind you, no matter what you hear back there saying it loves you." Garrick came slow. It was the hardest walk of his life, that 30 ft across needled ground he couldn't see, with his brother's voice behind him going from gentle to something else, something that lost the gentleness a little more with every step Garrick took away from it, until by the time his hand found the rough log wall of the cabin, the voice behind him in the fog was not really a voice anymore, and not really saying a name. And the old man's hand closed hard on Garrick's wrist and pulled him through a door, and a bar dropped, and there was the smell of wood smoke and tallow and old man and dog and a low fire and a single room, and the fog pressed its gray face against the one window and could come no farther. The old man was Obadiah Thresh, and he was the oldest living thing Garrick had ever stood close to. He looked to be past 70, and might have been past 80, with a white beard gone yellow at the mouth from pipe smoke, and eyes the pale flat blue of a winter sky, and skin like something tanned and left out. And he was small, smaller than Garrick by a head, but he moved around that cabin with a sureness that made the younger man feel like the frail one. He had a dog, an old gray thing with a clouded eye that did not bark and did not wag, only lay by the fire and watched the window with the unblinking patience of a creature that had given up expecting good news a long time ago. Thresh sat Garrick down on a 3-legged stool and put a tin cup of something hot snorts, and bitter in his hands, and waited, not talking while the shaking ran itself out of the younger man. And when Garrick could finally speak, the first thing he said was, "What is it out there? What's calling?" And the old man looked at him with those flat blue eyes and said, "You didn't answer it. Good. You'd be out there now if you had." Then he filled his pipe slow and lit it from the fire and said, "I'll tell you what I tell every poor soul the hush hands me, which ain't many, and most don't make it to my door. There's rules up here. You learn them or you don't leave. And you, son, you just broke the first one without knowing it by being out after the light went. So, sit and listen. And don't argue with me like a town man, 'cause I've been keeping these rules near 40 years, and you've been here 2 days. And here, I'm going to give you the rules the way old Thresh gave them to Garrick Voss that night, one at a time, by the fire with the fog at the window, because every one of them is going to matter before the night is out. The first rule," he said, is you are never ever in the hush after dark. You make your camp before the light goes amber, and you do not leave it for any reason till the light comes gray again. Not for water, not for a sound, not for a voice you'd give your soul to follow. The second rule, if you hear your name out there, you do not answer and you do not turn toward it, because the thing that calls does not know your name. It borrows it. It takes it off your tongue when you say it to yourself in your own head, and it gives it back to you in a voice you love, so you'll come and find out who's calling. The third rule, and Thresh said this one slowest, with the pipe smoke going up between them. If it walks beside you, and it will, you do not look at it straight. You look at your own 2 feet and you keep walking and you let it walk because it can wear a shape it borrows, but it can't hold the shape if you don't look. The looking is what gives it leave to be real. And the fourth rule, son. The fourth rule is the one that keeps you alive when all the others have failed you. You do not run. Whatever comes, however close it gets, you do not run. You stand still. You stand so still you could be a tree, because running is the one thing it's waiting for. Running is the only thing it knows for certain is prey. A thing that stands still might be a stone, might be a stump, might be a man too foolish to be afraid. And the hush is old and slow, and it has forever, and it will go around a still thing 9 times out of 10. But a running thing has never once in 40 years let go. Garrick sat with all that. The way you'd sit with a doctor telling you something you don't want to be true, and the practical surveyor in him kept trying to find the seam in it, the explanation, the loose board. He asked Thresh what the thing was. An animal, a man. Was it the fog itself, some swamp gas that made men hear things? And Thresh just shook his head slow and said, "You want it to be a name you already know, so you can stop being afraid of it, and I understand that. I wanted that too once, but it ain't a thing that has a name in any book you read at your college. It was here before the loggers. It was here before my granddad's granddad, and his people were here before yours. It's the reason the timber's still standing when every other stand for 100 miles is stumps. The company you work for, son, they'll never log the hush. They'll send men like you to measure it, and the men won't come back, or they'll come back wrong. And after enough of that, they'll write it off as bad country and leave it be, and that's how it likes things. It's patient. It's the most patient thing there is. Let me stop here a moment because I think this is the right place. If you've stayed with me this far into the dark, then you and I are the kind of company that suits each other, and I'd be glad to keep you longer. This story is being told to you by the fear behind you. If you've come this far and you're not subscribed, do that now. So the next dark night I light a fire like this one, you'll be sitting at it. And if you happen to be hearing my voice on some channel that isn't mine, with my words coming out of someone else's mouth, then know that they took this from us without asking. And you'd be doing us a kindness to report it. Now, a breath here before what comes next, because the worst of it is still ahead. If this voice is one you'd want to spend more time with, I keep a longer collection of these called the Hollow Files. 10 cases, 5 hours, the same kind of quiet trouble I'm telling you about right now. The link is down in the description and pinned at the very top of the comments. Go and find it later. For now, let me take you back to the cabin in the second night, because Garrick did not get to leave the hush in the morning, and I'll tell you why. In the morning, the fog was gone and the green light came back. And Garrick, being the man he was, decided in the clean light of day that he'd been the victim of his own rattled nerves and an old hermit's tall tales. And he thanked Thresh and shouldered his pack and set out to find the valley and finish his survey, the way a sensible man does. Thresh did not argue. He only stood in his doorway with the gray dog and said, "You keep the light at your back going down, and you make your camp early, and if you ain't out by the second evening, you come back here. You hear me? You come straight back here, and you don't stop for anything that knows your name." And Garrick said he would, the way you say a thing you don't mean, and he walked downhill all that morning. Downhill being the way mountains, that's the one thing a lost man can trust. Water runs down, and so does a man. And by noon, he should have struck the creek, and by evening the wagon rode. He did not strike the creek. He walked downhill for 6 hours, and the ground kept dropping away under him, and he never came to water. And that's not possible, you understand. That is a thing the world does not do. A man walking downhill all day must come to the bottom of something. and Garrick Voss stopped at last in the failing light at the foot of a slope he was certain he had stood at the top of 3 hours before. And he understood that the hush had simply turned him gently all day long, the way you'd turn a blindfolded man at a party, and that downhill in the hush did not mean out. It meant wherever the hush wanted him. And the light was going amber and he had broken his promise, and he was a long way from the cabin. He did the one smart thing left to him. He stopped trying to travel and he made his camp fast with hands that had started to shake again, and he got a fire going while there was still light to see his matches by. And he sat with his back to a great fallen log and his rifle across his knees, and he waited for the dark, and he tried to remember the rules. Don't move from your camp. Don't answer your name. Don't look straight. Don't run. He said them over to himself like a child saying prayers, and the dark came down, and the silence came with it. The heavy pressing silence, and his little fire seemed very small, a single orange coin of light with the whole black country leaning in around it. And after a while, out past the fire, the silence began to fill up, not with sound exactly, with presence. With a sense of things arranging themselves just past where the firelight reached, settling in, getting comfortable, the way a crowd settles into seats before a show. And then a stick cracked. One stick off in the dark, the way a stick cracks under a careful foot, and then nothing for a long while, and then another, closer from the other side. And Garrick sat very still with his back against the log, and did not look toward the cracks, fixed his eyes on the fire, on the small, honest burning of the wood, and he waited. It came to the edge of the firelight a little before what his watch, when he dared to look at it, said was midnight. He felt it before he saw even the shape of it, felt the cold of it come across the clearing ahead of it like the cold that comes off an open ice-house door, and he kept his eyes on the fire, and he heard it stop just at the edge, just where the orange light gave out into black, and he heard it breathe. It breathed slow and wet and enormous, a sound like a tide going out over stones, and Garrick did not look at it. He looked at the fire and he gripped his rifle, and he did not look. And the thing at the edge of the light said, in his brother's voice, soft and hurt and so terribly real, "Garrick, why'd you leave me in the water?" And I'll tell you, friends, that of all the things it could have said, that was the one aimed straight at the stone in his boot. The thing he carried and didn't talk about, his brother gone. In the spring flood 2 years before, and the guilt he'd never set down, and the voice knew it. The voice had reached into him and taken the worst private grief he owned and was holding it up to the light. "Why'd you let go of my hand?" the voice said. "You could have held on." And Garrick Voss sat by his fire with tears running down into his close-trimmed mustache and his teeth shut so hard his jaw ached, and he did not answer, and he did not look. And somewhere in the worst of it, a piece of him understood that this was exactly the trap, that grief was the bait, that the thing fed on the part of you that most wanted to be forgiven, and he held onto that understanding the way he should have held his brother's hand, and he did not let go of it. And slowly, slowly, the cold drew back and the breathing moved off, and the voice faded. And just before the gray light came, Garrick heard, far off, the long single not quite word he'd heard the very first night, and then the birds. The birds came back all at once, a whole forest of them, as if a hand had been lifted off the world and he was alive and it was morning. And he was on his feet and moving before he'd half decided to, back uphill, back the way Thresh had told him, back toward the cabin, running. And that's the thing I need you to hold, because he broke the rule. He ran. He'd held still all night and done everything right, and then in the gray relief of morning he let himself run, just to be moving, just to be away. And the moment his boots started pounding the soft ground, he heard behind him something that had been still go to ground and start to follow, low and fast and eager. The eagerness of a thing that has finally been given the one signal it understands. He ran and it ran. He could hear it gaining, not footsteps exactly, a kind of rushing, a coming on. And the cabin was a long way and the slope was against him and his breath was sawing in his chest, and he knew with total clarity that he was not going to make it, that running had killed him just as the old man said it would. And then the cabin was there, impossibly just ahead through the trees with its smoke going up. and old Obadiah Thresh was standing in front of it with the gray dog beside him and the door open behind. And the old man's face when he saw Garrick coming, saw him running, was a thing Garrick never forgot because it was not surprise, it was grief. It was the grief of a man watching something he'd seen too many times before, and Thresh did not run to help him. Thresh stood his ground. And as Garrick came pounding up the last of the slope with the rushing thing right behind him, the old man raised both his thin arms out wide, not to Garrick but to the thing. And he called out to it in a language Garrick had never heard, 3 words hard and old. And then Thresh looked Garrick dead in the eye, and what he said was the simplest thing in the world. "Don't run, stay still." And Garrick Voss stopped. With every screaming nerve in his body telling him the cabin door was 10 steps away and safety was 10 steps away, he planted his feet and he stopped dead, an arm's length from the old man. And he stood as still as a stump, as a stone, as a tree that had grown there 100 years. And he shut his eyes, and the rushing thing that had been right behind him, that had been a half-second from him, went past. He felt it go past. He felt the cold of it pour around him on both sides like floodwater around a piling. Felt the wet, enormous breath of it move his hair and frost the sweat on his neck. And it did not take him because he was still. Because a still thing is a stone, and the hush is old and slow, and it went around. And Garrick stood with his eyes shut and his fists clenched and his lungs burning, holding stiller than he'd ever held anything. And the old man's voice came once more, low, steady, almost gentle. "Now you can open your eyes, son. Slow. It's looking at me." And Garrick opened his eyes. And this is the part where I tell you that Garrick Voss never raised his voice again for the rest of his life, and never once told a living soul exactly what he saw in that clearing in front of old Thresh's cabin in the gray morning light. He wrote a great deal in the years after, filled notebooks, tried 100 times to put it down. And every page he ever wrote about that one moment ends the same way, with the words too terrible to describe. The words a man uses when the thing he saw broke the part of him that makes words. What we know is what he could bear to set down around the edges of it. We know the thing had taken the old man's offering and turned its attention to him, to Thresh, the way it does to the one who calls it. We know it was tall, taller than the cabin, and that it was made of the things the hush had taken over all its long years, that Garrick said he saw in the shape of its suggestions of every lost soul the woods had ever swallowed. A great slow assembly of borrowed faces and borrowed grief. And that one of the faces in it, just for a moment looking out at him with a terrible patient sorrow, was a face he knew, a face he'd been hearing in the fog for 2 nights, his own brother taken not by the spring flood at all. The records that brought him there had been wrong or made wrong, his brother taken here years before by the same thing and kept. We know that Garrick stood and looked at it, at all of it, for the length of takes a man's whole life to rearrange itself, and that he made no sound because there was no sound left in him, and that this was the moment the title of tonight's story is built on, the seconds after the old man said, "Don't run, stay still." The seconds in which Garrick Voss looked upon the thing in the hush and was struck dumb, struck speechless for the rest of his days. What happened next, Garrick himself was never entirely sure of, and here is where the story keeps its last and worst secret. He says the old man, Thresh, was talking to it the whole time, low and steady in that old hard language, the way you talk a wild horse down, the way you talk to something you'd been talking to for 40 years. He says Thresh took a step toward it, and another, putting himself between the thing and the still silent surveyor, and that the last clear thing he remembers is the old man turning his head just slightly, not all the way, never taking his eyes off the thing, and saying to Garrick out of the side of his mouth 2 words, "Go home." And then Garrick was inside the cabin, though he doesn't remember crossing the threshold, and the bar was down across the door, though he doesn't remember dropping it. And the gray dog was sitting at his feet looking up at him with its one clouded eye, and through the single window the clearing was empty. The fire under the kettle was still warm. The old man's pipe lay on the 3-legged stool, still faintly smoking. And Obadiah Thresh was gone, and the thing was gone, and the birds were singing, and it was a clear, bright, ordinary morning in the autumn of 1911, as if none of it had happened at all. Garrick stayed in that cabin 2 more days, too broken to move, fed by nothing but the cornmeal he found in a sack and water from the rain barrel, with the gray dog never leaving his side. And on the third morning, the dog got up and went to the door and looked back at him, and Garrick understood. He opened the door, and the dog walked out and down the slope, and Garrick followed it. And the dog led him by a path no compass would have found, downhill and downhill. And this time, the downhill meant out. This time the world behaved, and by evening they struck the Black Creek, and by full dark they struck the wagon road, and the dog stopped at the edge of the road where the hush ended and the ordinary woods began, and it would not go a step farther. And Garrick knelt down in the road and put his arms around its neck the way you'd think a person. And when he stood up and looked, the dog was gone, the way they go, between one breath and the next. And there was only the empty road and the lights of Cold Mount far down at the bottom of it. Weston Crail, the storekeeper, looked up when the door jangled, and he saw the surveyor standing there, gray-faced, his clothes hanging off him, his eyes the eyes of a much older man. And Crail set down what he was holding and did not say a word, only poured a glass and pushed it across the counter, because Crail had seen men come back out of the hush before, the few that came back, and he knew the look, and he knew that you do not ask. After a long while, Garrick managed to say one thing. He asked about Old Thresh, and the storekeeper got a strange, careful look, and he said, "Son, I want you to listen to me. Obadiah Thresh was the man's name, yes, but Obadiah Thresh died the winter I was a boy. My own father helped carry him down. There ain't been a living man up in the hush in 50 years. And then Crail leaned across the counter, and in a low voice, the way you tell a man the worst thing and the only comfort all at once, he said, "But they do say, the ones that come back, they all say the same thing, that there's an old fellow up there keeps the rules and keeps the door and sends home the ones he can. We figure it's Thresh. We figure he stayed. We figure somebody's got to stand between that thing and the rest of us, and he was the last one to know how, so he stays, and he keeps standing still, and he doesn't run, and that's why you're standing here drinking my whiskey instead of walking around up there with a borrowed face calling other men's names in the fog. And that's the story, more or less, as Garrick Voss left it to be told." He went back down to the valley, and he turned in his survey, and where the 4,000 acres of timber should have been measured and marked, he had written across the page in a hand gone shaky, "Do not log this tract. Do not send men." And the company thought he'd lost his nerve, and maybe he had, but they never did log the hush, and the timber is standing there yet, last I heard, dark and close and quiet with no birds in it. Garrick lived another 40 years. He married. He kept his books and his maps. He was by all accounts a gentle and a careful man, but he never raised his voice, not in anger, not in joy, not once. Because somewhere in those silent seconds in the clearing, the part of him that shouted had been taken out and not given back. And his wife said that on certain nights, autumn nights when the fog came up off the low ground, he would go very still in his chair by the fire and his eyes would go far away. And he would tilt his head as if he were listening to something a long way off, something calling a name. And that at those times, if you spoke to him, he would not answer, would not turn toward you, would only keep his eyes on the fire and stay perfectly still until whatever it was had passed. He'd learned the rules, you see. He kept them the rest of his life, and maybe that's the real ending and maybe it isn't. But here's the thing that I can't quite shake, the thing I'll leave with you. The dog led him out, an old gray dog with one clouded eye that walked him down out of the hush and turned back at the road. And when Garrick, years later, finally asked Weston Crail in a letter whether Old Thresh had ever kept a dog up there, Crail wrote back just one line. "Thresh had a gray dog," the letter said, "lost his eye to a trap the same winter Thresh passed. They went into the ground together." So I'll let you sit with that the way Garrick had to, who walked beside him down that slope, what stood between him and the thing in the clearing, and whether the old man who told him don't run, stay still, was warning him or teaching him or simply welcoming him one more careful soul into the long, patient company of those who keep watch up there in the hush and never leave and never run and stand so still that they could be stones. And you, listening to me tonight on whatever quiet road or in whatever lit-up city you're sitting in, do you believe there are places that don't run by the rules the rest of the world runs by? Places that keep what they take. Tell me in the comments. And if you know a story like this one, an old family story, a thing a grandfather swore was true, share it down below because the best ones I tell here started exactly that way, as somebody's comment late at night. And if this one stayed with you, if you find yourself tonight a little more aware of the silence in your own house, then the Hollow Files is waiting for you in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. 10 more like this. 5 hours of the dark. Subscribe so you don't lose the fire. And whatever you do, wherever you are, if you ever find yourself somewhere quiet and the birds have all gone still and something far off calls your name in a voice you love, don't answer it. Don't look at it. And whatever else you do, don't run, stay still. Until next time.